Now let's talk about factoring in bluff outs when you have drawing hands on the turn. There are certain situations where it's highly likely that your opponent will fold to a bet on the river when you hit some of your drawing hands. Knowing this, we can take advantage of those opponents by sometimes calling with long shot draws with the intention of either A, hitting a home run, or B, bluffing your opponent when a more traditional draw hits the river. I call those bluffing outs, cards that could hit the river that will scare your opponent into folding the best hand. Using bluff outs in your calculations on the turn is pretty advanced. Not only are you now factoring in your pot odds, odds of improving, odds of drawing to a second best hand, and implied odds, you should also think about what cards could hit the river that will likely win you the pot by allowing you to bluff your opponent. Being able to read your opponent and understand their tendencies and their likely hole cards is a big part of using bluff outs. Let's look at an example. With blinds at 100-200, a tight opponent raises from first position to 600. Both you and your opponent have 45,000 apiece, and you call the 600 with 3-5 of clubs for middle position. All others fold. The flop comes 5, 6, 7, giving you bottom pair and a gut shot straight shot to the idiot end. You could easily have the best hand here with a pair of fives, but if your opponent bets it hard on the flop and the turn, he probably has a big overpair. Okay, so on the flop, your opponent bets 1,000. Now, trying to catch a 3, 4, or 5, you call the bet. The turn card is the jack of clubs, giving you a backdoor flush draw as well. With 3,500 in the pot, your opponent overbets the pot, betting 7,000. Now it's time to go through your routine, as you see here. So, we have pot odds, 7,000 to win 10,500 is 1.5 to 1. Odds of improving your hand, there's 3 threes, 2 fives, 3 fours, and 9 spades equals 17 outs out of 46 unseen cards. That's 17 good ones and 29 bad ones. So that works out to about 1.7 to 1. Despite the fact that you likely have a ton of outs against your opponent, you're still not getting the right price to call the bet, unless you factor in implied odds as well as bluff outs. There are loads of cards that could hit the river that miss your hand completely, but would look like they could easily hit your hand. An 8 would put an open-ended 4-card straight on the board. A 9 would mean that if you had the 4-card straight draw with an 8, that it just completed that draw. On top of that, the flush draw on the flop is a hand you could easily represent if it hits the river. I'm going to remind you one more time to stress the importance of this. In order to make plays like the following, it's essential that you have a very good read on your opponent's tendencies. If you don't, I would advise avoiding these plays altogether. With the type of draw you have, there are some cards that could hit on the river that would win you a really big pot. There are also a lot of cards that could hit that will scare your opponent into thinking that you just hit one of your draws. If you only play suited connectors with the hopes of making straights and flushes, you'll become very easy to read. Sure, people will know that you play all kinds of goofy hands, but they will soon catch on to the fact that when the funky draw hits and you bet big, that you've got it. Perceptive players will stop paying you off unless you mix up your play by making some calculated bluffs as well. Let's take a look at how to proceed with various cards hitting the river after calling the 7,000 bet. A club. Obviously, if a club hits, completing your flush, you're going to look to make a value bet in the hopes that it gets paid off. With 17,500 in the pot, a bet of anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000 will put some pressure on your opponent, but not so much so that he might not actually look you up. After all, there was only one club on the flop, so it will be difficult for your opponent to believe you hit a backdoor flush. A straight. If you hit the straight, it will be the dummy end with the 4. But since your opponent is a conservative player, it's unlikely that he has an 8 in his hand. As far as betting amounts go, you have a lot of options, but understand that your opponent will be hard-pressed to call anything. You could even try to milk him for as little as 5,000, but it's probably better to bet between 7,000 and 9,000. Reason being, you don't want your value bets to stick out by making them so much smaller than your bluffs. You don't want to make your bluffs any smaller either, since that will make them less effective. Trips. A 5 is probably the absolute best card you can catch, as your opponent might think it was a good card for his pocket aces. If you hit trips on the river and you put your opponent on an overpair, you should go for a good payday, betting between 12,000 to 15,000 on the river. 2 pair. Your opponent isn't going to be too scared of a 3. But at the same time, he isn't going to bet that card either. If you bet the river, he's probably going to pay you off with an overpair. So once again, I would suggest the bet between 9,000 and 12,000. An 8. Now, if the river's an 8, this gives you a good opportunity to steal the pot from your opponent. You don't want this bet to look any different from a bet you'd make had you actually made the hand for real. If you bet 12,000 on the river, your opponent would be hard-pressed to call. He might, but even if he called you, half the time, your river bluff would still be profitable, as you're risking 12,000 to win 17,500. If a 9 hits the river, play it the exact same way you would as an 8. If a spade hits the river, This is the most common draw that you could be on after calling the flop bet and is probably the card your opponent is most afraid of. You want to play it as if you were looking to get paid off handsomely and should try betting between 12 to 15,000. As is the case with all the other various scenarios, the amount you should ultimately choose should depend on your opponent and his perception of you. Also, past hands that he's witnessed you play. So as you can see, despite the fact that you really only have what looks like 17 outs, when you factor in the bluff outs, there are 28 cards that could help you win the pot. That's well over half the deck. Of course, it's not that simple, obviously, as you'll get yourself into trouble occasionally when you hit your hand and it's a loser. Or when your bluffs get called by an opponent who just doesn't believe you. Overall, though, adding these plays to your repertoire will help you out in the long run since your value bet to bluff ratio will be very high. Bluffs are most effective when used sporadically and in situations where it seems obvious to your opponent that you must have the best hand.